Well, thank you very much. Let me say at the outset what a great honor it is to be with you, and what a great honor it is, not just for me personally, but for the Government of Canada and for our great country to be recognized for its advocacy and its work with respect to human rights. It is also a tremendous honor to be with you on this evening to help celebrate UN Watch's 20th anniversary. It's also an opportunity to recognize the ongoing vigilance that you have maintained at the United Nations, both here in New York and in Geneva, for the past 20 years. I'm particularly honored that my colleague in the House of Commons, Irwin Cotler, could be with us today. In Canada, we don't have the same nonpartisan approach in our Parliament as you do in your Congress. So having a member of the opposition say such kind words is a special treat for me. I think I spend more time with Irwin than I spend with some members of my own family. And he regularly comes in with a long list of advice cases, and which I greatly appreciate his friendship. Irwin also was a man ahead of his time. We were very pleased to celebrate a victory when the European Union listed the military wing of Hezbollah, but it was under Irwin's leadership as Minister of Justice that Canada, 10 years ago, issued a terrorist designation against the entire organization of Hezbollah. And so he was a man ahead of his time and provided great leadership to our country, and continues to do so in Parliament and to me personally as Foreign Minister. So thank you so much for being here, Irwin. As I find it a bit daunting to speak after the impressive group of speakers who I think have said all that needs to be said, but as you know, the United Nations Watch exists to monitor the performance of the UN by the yardstick of its own charter, and also promotes equal treatment of member states. And I believe that the true enemies of the United Nations, the true enemies of the values and principles that inspired not just the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but inspired the creation of the UN, are those people who remain quiet, who remain silent, and watch the slow decline of a once great institution. And that's why it's a tremendous pleasure for me to be here with you tonight, because so many people in this room, all of you, share the same common values and principles when it comes to the conduct of foreign affairs. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Stephen Harper, Canada has a reinvigorated foreign policy on the world stage. Like you, we don't take positions to be popular, for convenience, for expediency, or reward. We do so for some very simple reasons: to give voice to the voiceless, to challenge the aggressor, to promote and protect human dignity around the world. And this should not be a unique position. This should not be something that only a select few countries do. This should be done on a wider scale, and I'm sure if it were, the face of the United Nations and the world itself would be a very different one. On July the 12th of this year, a 16-year-old Pakistani girl walked into the headquarters of the United Nations and addressed the nations of the world. Malala Yousafzai, an advocate for female education and a victim of Taliban terrorism and violence, explained her struggle when she said, "I raise up my voice, not so that I can shout, but so that those without a voice can be heard." And in front of the world, Malala refused to be quiet. Instead of accepting the world she was born into, Malala continues her fight for basic human rights and fundamental freedoms. And Prime Minister Stephen Harper and myself had the great honor to meet with Malala earlier this week. We heard firsthand the story of her courage, that she has inspired and encouraged literally millions around the world. And I should tell Irwin, as she lay recovering in her hospital bed in Birmingham, England, her father was able to tell her the story about how all Canadian political parties, all Canadian parliamentarians unanimously came together, not just to speak of her courage and her struggle, but to give a unanimous support for her. And sometimes we wonder whether we can make a difference, and when you hear a story like that, it warmed my heart. It is that spirit that Canada approaches the United Nations. We raise our voices not to shout, but to stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. And while our detractors in Canada like to criticize us for doing so, our Prime Minister has made it clear that Canada has no intention to go along with the crowd in order that we might avoid some difficult issues. that is no longer how Canada operates on the world stage. Canada has principles and Canada has values, and it is in defense of those values that we act. We refuse to be quiet when the United Nations gave titles to dictators like Robert Mugabe, while tens of thousands of people in Zimbabwe face poverty, face disease, face violence. We refuse to compromise on the fundamental freedoms that unite us all, that should unite us all. Chapter 1 of the Charter of the United Nations makes it very clear what the purpose of that organization is: to maintain international peace and security, to prevent and remove threats and aggressors to the community, and to promote respect for human rights, and just as importantly, to promote fundamental freedoms. They are more than just words. It is our duty to pull them from the printed page and to breathe life into them and to practice them each and every day. When Canada sees the United Nations falling short of its principles, we're not afraid to stand up. And we don't do it because we're anti-UN. We do it because we believe that when the United Nations lives up to the important founding principles and embraces what it does well, it can be a tremendous force for good. But when you have United Nations officials like Richard Falk spewing mean-spirited anti-Semitic rhetoric in the wake of the terrorist bombing this past April in Boston, how does that further human progress? And how does that reflect on the UN? How does that help the Palestinian people, whom he claims to protect? It doesn't. And what absolutely astounded me, that this was just the latest one in a long string of mean-spirited, hateful rhetoric that was, some of which was recounted to you earlier. So I immediately said, this man must be fired by the United Nations Secretary General. And I was told, that I didn't understand. I didn't understand how the UN operates. You see, these special rapporteurs have to be free to speak their mind. And it was wrong. It was wrong to put the Secretary General in that type of position, demand the resignation, demand that he be fired, rather that we should recommend that he consider resigning. No way. No way. And when in a move of unbridled hypocrisy, Iran became president of the United Nations Conference on Disarmament, Canada shut the door. Why? Because we must take a stand and speak out when the very country entrusted to chair of that group is the same country which refuses to open the books on its own nuclear program. We also see time and time again at the United Nations the willing to engage in moral relativism. We believe that Israel has every right to exist, and it also has the right to defend its people and its way of life. But when the United Nations struggles to condemn blatant terrorist acts, yet passes numerous one-sided resolutions against the state of Israel, how does that instill confidence in that body? Over the past 20 years, I've had the occasion to visit Israel many, many times. On one such visit, just a few months before I was elected to the federal parliament and became a minister in Stephen Harper's government, we were having dinner with some Canadian diplomats in the city of Jerusalem overlooking the old city. It was a great evening. I, at the time, was a member of the opposition. And I looked. See, Irwin was only beginning to have some major effect on Canada's foreign policy with respect to Israel. But I looked at our ambassador to Israel, and I said, you know, why does Canada vote against Israel so often at the General Assembly? Why do we always vote for these one-sided resolutions which condemn the only liberal democratic state in the Middle East? You see, at that time, we still did. The official paused, looked down at me, both figuratively and quite literally. I was a provincial legislator at the time, and gave me the go-along to get-along response. You see, that I didn't understand. These resolutions every year, they were meaningless. They were just the same ones every year, that they didn't matter. Well, I interrupted. If they're meaningless and they don't matter, why do we get on board with these resolutions year after year after year? Well, that's no longer how Canada operates, not under this foreign minister and not under Prime Minister Stephen Harper. And You know, my young assistant called an official into their office shortly before the General Assembly was to vote on their annual anti-Israel hate fest. And he informed him that we were changing the last of the 11 votes that we hadn't changed. And he was told by the Assistant Deputy Minister that this was going to be the biggest change in Canadian foreign policy in a generation or two. That there would be a full-on Arab trade boycott of Canada, and that bad things would happen. Well, this young man asked the guy to leave his office. And the ADM tried to actually get in behind me and behind my Deputy Minister to meet with the Prime Minister to tell him of this looming calamity that would face our country. We changed our votes at the UN. I didn't get a single media call. I didn't get a single question in the House of Commons. Well, it's probably because of Irwin. In fact, 3 weeks later, I traveled to the Arab world, spent 5 days, sat down for 45 minutes, one-on-one with Palestinian Prime Minister Salam Fayyad, and no one raised it. So you see, it didn't take courage. It didn't take conviction. It just take doing what you believed was right and not worrying about the consequences. You see, we pay attention. We think that the United Nations resolutions are relevant, and that we believe that any type of anti-Israeli rhetoric undermines the very institution that should be promoting liberal democracies and not seeking to cut them down. This isn't an anti-UN view. You see, I believe this is a pro-UN view. The UN that was created so many years ago. We could do what we did for decades and ignore the UN shortcomings. Or we could take a different, more honest approach and say when Richard Falk blames the Boston bombings on President Obama and the State of Israel, that it looks bad on the United Nations, very bad. It delegitimizes the work that the UN does and the principles that that institution stands for. The good news, and there is good news, the good news is that when UN Watch recognizes and speaks up, and well, this helps the UN reach its full potential. And we would like to work with UN Watch. We're pleased and honored to do that. We also believe that when we let our values and principles guide us together, we can achieve great things. In closing, let me say once again how honored I am to be here tonight and to spend time celebrating UN Watch, this great organization's 20th anniversary, an organization that is never afraid to speak up and speak truth to power. I look forward to hearing about your ongoing work. Canada looks forward to working with you here in New York and in Geneva so that we can promote the basic principles and values that unite us all. Standing up for human rights, standing up for freedom, standing up for democracy, standing up for the dignity of the individual. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.